The wind came first, rolling low across the plains like a warning whispered by the land itself, bending the tall grass and carrying dust from the far edges of nowhere. Dawn had barely broken when she ran, barefoot and breathless, her dress torn at the hem, her hair loose and wild against her face. The soil cut into her feet, sharp and unforgiving, yet she did not slow. Fear drove her harder than pain ever could, fear born not of the open land ahead, but of the place she had left behind. Behind her lay her family's farm, a stretch of land ruled not by seasons or mercy, but by a man whose words struck harder than drought. The farmhouse stood on a rise, dark against the pale sky, its windows empty like watching eyes. She had lived there her entire life, yet never once had it felt like home. That land had taken her youth, her voice, and nearly her will. And when the choice was finally placed before her, she chose to run rather than disappear quietly into a life already decided. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. As she crossed the open fields, the sun crept higher, revealing the vastness ahead. The west stretched wide and silent, beautiful and cruel in equal measure. Every step took her farther from certainty and closer to danger, but the freedom of it made her chest ache. For the first time in her life, no one was shouting her name, no one was telling her what she owed or who she belonged to. Then came the sound that stopped her cold, hoofbeats. They were distant at first, faint enough to be mistaken for thunder, but there were no clouds in the sky. The sound grew clearer, faster, cutting through the quiet like a blade. Panic surged through her, tightening her throat. She ran harder, glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see men from the farm, ropes in hand, faces set with the certainty of ownership. Instead, a single rider crested the rise. The horse was dark and powerful, moving with practiced ease. The man in the saddle sat straight, steady, his outline sharp against the rising sun. He did not shout. He did not raise a weapon. He simply watched her as he closed the distance, as if measuring not her value but her truth. She stumbled then, her strength giving out after miles of fear. The ground rushed up to meet her, and she braced for hands that would drag her back to the life she had fled. But they never came. The hoofbeats stopped beside her, and silence returned, heavier than before. When she looked up, the cowboy had dismounted. He stood a few paces away, tall and lean, dust clinging to his boots and coat. His face was weathered, shaped by sun and wind, the kind of face that told a story without speaking it. His eyes held no hunger, no judgment, only caution and something quieter, something that looked like understanding earned the hard way. He asked no questions at first. He offered her water. That simple act unsettled her more than threats ever had. She took the canteen with shaking hands, drinking deeply, her fear slowly giving way to confusion. Men in her life had always wanted something. This one simply waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, shaped by long hours of silence rather than conversation. He asked where she was headed. She told him she did not know. He asked who was chasing her. She said no one, though the lie sat heavy between them. He did not press her further. Instead, he looked back toward the distant farm, then toward the endless land ahead. The choice he made in that moment would alter both their lives, though neither of them yet understood how deeply. He told her she could ride with him as far as the next water stop, no farther. He said it like a rule, firm but fair. She agreed because she had no better option. They rode side by side, the horse's steady pace giving her time to breathe, to think, to feel the weight of what she had done. She expected fear to return, expected regret to take hold, but instead she felt something unfamiliar growing inside her, something close to hope. As the miles passed, the land changed, rolling hills giving way to dry creek beds and scattered trees bent by years of harsh weather. The cowboy spoke little, but when he did, his words carried purpose. She learned his name was Caleb, learned he had no home he cared to return to, learned he worked where work could be found and slept under open skies more often than not. He did not ask her name until midday, when the sun stood high and the heat pressed down on them both. When she told him, he nodded once, as if committing it to memory. He never repeated it aloud. They stopped near a stand of cottonwoods, the shade offering brief relief. As they ate, distant riders appeared on the horizon, small at first, then clearer. Caleb's body tensed, his gaze narrowing. He counted them quietly, his jaw tightening. They were not looking for him. She knew that without being told. Caleb did not draw his gun. He did not mount his horse. He simply told her they would leave, now. His tone carried urgency, not fear. They moved quickly, cutting across the land rather than following any road, the sun burning overhead as the riders fell behind but did not disappear. By nightfall, they reached a shallow canyon where the land dipped low and shadows gathered early. They made camp there, hidden from open sight. The fire was small, carefully tended. The stars above were sharp and countless, stretching farther than she had ever imagined. It was there, in that quiet place between danger and rest, that she finally spoke the truth. She told him about the farm, about the life chosen for her without her consent, about the anger that ruled her father's house like law. She spoke of a future promised to a man she did not love, a bargain struck with land and debt instead of care. Her voice shook as she spoke, but she did not stop. Caleb listened without interruption. When she finished, he said only that men like that did not stop easily. He said the land remembered cruelty longer than kindness. He said running was not weakness, but surviving required more than distance. The night passed slowly, each sound carrying weight. At dawn, Caleb made his decision. He would take her farther than planned, as far as the next town where she could disappear among strangers. It was more than he had intended to offer, and both of them knew it. As they rode on, the danger did not fade. The riders returned, closer now, more determined. Tension grew with every mile, every glance back. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, yet in the midst of fear, something else began to form. Trust, fragile and unspoken. She watched the way Caleb scanned the horizon, the way he positioned himself slightly ahead of her, always between her and danger. He watched the way she sat straighter in the saddle each day, the way her eyes no longer held only fear but resolve. By the time the town appeared in the distance, dust rising from its streets, neither of them felt the relief they expected. Parting meant safety, but it also meant returning to solitude, to paths chosen alone. Caleb slowed his horse as they approached, his expression unreadable. He told her this was where he would leave her. He told her she would be safer here. His words were practical, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, something unsettled. She looked at the town, then back at the land behind them. She realized then that her journey had only begun, that fleeing had been the first step, not the last. The West did not grant freedom easily. It tested those who sought it, demanded courage beyond escape. As they rode into the edge of town, the sound of life rose around them, voices and movement and possibility. The danger had not passed. The men chasing her were still out there. The land still held its memory. And somewhere between fear and choice, between the life she fled and the future yet unseen, a lone cowboy had already changed the course of her life forever. The town rose from the dust like a promise that had been broken and rebuilt too many times to count. Wooden buildings leaning into one another as if sharing secrets, the street alive with the sounds of wagons creaking, boots striking hard earth, and voices roughened by years of wind and want. Eliza felt the weight of every stare as she rode beside Caleb, aware of her torn dress, her bare feet now wrapped in borrowed cloth, and the way fear still clung to her like a second skin. Towns were meant to offer safety, yet this one felt like a place where truths were traded as cheaply as lies. Caleb slowed near the edge, his horse breathing easy as if it too sensed a crossing from open danger into crowded uncertainty. He told her again that this was where their road parted, that a woman could vanish among strangers if she was careful and strong enough. His voice carried no softness, yet she heard something beneath it, something like reluctance. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, because she knew that stepping down from that horse would mean standing on her own for the first time in her life. Before she could dismount, a commotion rippled through the street ahead. A pair of men argued outside the saloon, one shoving the other hard enough to send him into a post. Laughter followed, sharp and careless. Eliza flinched, memories rising uninvited. Caleb's hand tightened briefly on the reins. He watched the crowd with the practiced awareness of someone who had learned to expect trouble wherever men gathered. He helped her down despite his words of parting, steadying her with a grip that was firm but respectful. He pressed a few coins into her palm, telling her it was enough for food and a room if she did not linger. She tried to refuse, pride flaring, but he closed her fingers around the money and stepped back before she could argue. He said he would leave once he saw her safely inside the boarding house at the far end of the street. As they walked, Elisa felt the town pressing in on her, the closeness of buildings and bodas a sharp contrast to the open plains. She caught fragments of conversation, rumors of cattle drives and lost gold, of men who had not returned from the hills. She felt eyes linger too long, measuring her vulnerability. Caleb positioned himself slightly ahead, his presence a quiet barrier. The boarding house door creaked open, revealing a woman with sharp eyes and a posture that suggested she had seen too much to be surprised by anything. The woman looked Eliza over, then Caleb, then back again. She asked no questions that mattered. She took the coins and told Eliza she could have a small room upstairs, food included if she worked in the kitchen. Eliza agreed without hesitation. Work had never frightened her. Being owned had. Caleb waited until the door closed behind her. He stood in the street a moment longer, scanning the town one last time. He told himself that this was enough, that he had done what he could. He mounted his horse and rode out with the same quiet resolve that had brought him in, though the road ahead felt heavier than before. Eliza spent the afternoon scrubbing pots and carrying water, the simple tasks grounding her nerves. The boarding house smelled of stew and soap, a scent that felt almost like kindness. Yet even there, safety felt thin. She caught sight of 3 men through the window near dusk, their horses tied carelessly, their eyes sharp as they took in the street. She knew them without needing to see their faces clearly. They belonged to her past, sent by a will that did not accept refusal. Fear surged, but she did not freeze. She remembered Caleb's words about surviving requiring more than distance. She finished her work, thanked the boarding house woman, and slipped upstairs as if nothing were wrong. In her small room, she packed what little she had, heart pounding, listening to the sounds below. The men entered the building. Their voices carried, confident and loud. They asked questions with the certainty of those who believe the world answered to them. Eliza waited until their boots moved away, then climbed out the window onto the narrow ledge. She lowered herself carefully, ignoring the scrape against her palms, and dropped into the alley. The sky was darkening, the street lamps just beginning to glow. She moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, heading not toward the road east, but toward the livery at the far end of town. She did not know how to ride well, but she knew how to try. At the same time, Caleb felt it in his bones, a wrongness that would not settle. He had not gone far before he turned his horse back toward town. He told himself it was foolish, that she would be fine, yet the memory of the riders on the horizon burned in his mind. As he approached, he saw the unfamiliar horses tied near the saloon, saw the way men gathered with purpose. He dismounted and moved quietly, listening. When he heard her name spoken with possession, his jaw tightened. He did not rush in. He watched, waited, learning where the men were, how they moved. When he saw Eliza slip into the alley, he followed at a distance, heart pounding with a mix of relief and fear. She reached the livery just as one of the men spotted her. A shout rang out, sharp and commanding. The chase tore through the back streets, chaos breaking loose as townsfolk scattered. Eliza ran with everything she had, her breath burning, her resolve hardening with each step. Caleb moved faster, cutting across, reaching her as she stumbled near the stable door. He lifted her onto a horse without hesitation, swinging up behind her as shots cracked the air. The horse bolted, hooves striking sparks from stone as they burst into the open road. They rode hard into the night, the town falling away behind them. The men followed, their silhouettes stark against the lamplight, but the distance grew with every desperate stride. The land opened again, wide and dark, the stars wheeling overhead. When at last the pursuit faded, Caleb slowed the horse, both of them breathing hard. Eliza turned to him, tears streaking her face, anger and gratitude tangled together. She asked why he had come back. He told her the truth, that some choices followed a man whether he wanted them to or not. He told her that leaving her there had felt wrong in a way he could not ignore. They made camp far from the road, hidden among low hills. The fire was small, the silence heavy. Eliza spoke then, not of fear, but of resolve. She said she would not run any more, not without a plan, not without standing for herself. She said she wanted to learn, to become someone the past could not drag back so easily. Caleb listened, the firelight cutting lines across his face. He saw in her not a burden but a strength he had underestimated. He told her he could not promise safety, that the road ahead would be hard and the men chasing her would not give up easily. He told her he could teach her some things if she was willing to learn, and if she understood that choosing this path meant choosing its risks. She agreed without hesitation. The night stretched on, the land holding their secret. In the distance a coyote cried, the sound lonely and fierce. Eliza lay awake, staring at the stars, knowing that the town had been a test she had barely survived, and that the West would demand more before it granted anything in return. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the past still hunted her. But for the first time, she did not feel alone. Morning came slow and pale, the kind of dawn that felt earned rather than given, light spilling over the low hills and waking the land without ceremony. Eliza rose before Caleb, sitting near the dying embers of the fire, her knees drawn close as she watched the sky change color. The fear that had driven her across fields and through towns still lived inside her, but it no longer ruled her hands. There was a steadiness there now, fragile but real, built from the knowledge that she had chosen this road and survived the night because of it. Caleb stirred as the sun climbed, his movements careful and quiet. He took in their surroundings with a practiced glance, measuring distance and cover, the habits of a man who trusted the land more than luck. He handed Eliza a tin cup of water and told her they would move before the heat settled in. The men hunting her would search the roads first, believing speed mattered more than patience. Caleb intended to give them neither. They rode north into rougher country, where the ground broke into stone and scrub, where horses tired quickly and riders were forced to think rather than chase. Caleb showed Eliza how to read the land, how to spot the faint signs of passage, how to move in a way that left as little trace as possible. He taught without lectures, correcting her gently when she erred, letting her learn through doing rather than shame. By midday her legs ached and her hands burned from the reins, yet she did not complain. Each mile carried her farther from the girl who had run barefoot at dawn. Each mile demanded strength she had never been allowed to discover. Caleb noticed the change, the way her posture shifted, the way her gaze lifted to meet the horizon instead of the ground. They reached a narrow valley by afternoon, its walls rising steep and uneven, shadows pooling along its edges. A thin stream cut through the center, water clear and cold. Caleb decided they would rest there, not long enough to be careless, but long enough to recover. Eliza dismounted stiffly, easing herself down with a breath she did not realize she had been holding. As they ate, Caleb spoke of the valley, of men who had vanished there chasing riches or revenge, of storms that could flood the low ground without warning. His voice carried no drama, only fact. Eliza listened, understanding that the land was not cruel by nature but indifferent, demanding respect rather than obedience. It was there that the sound reached them, faint but unmistakable, voices carried on the wind from the south. Eliza froze, her heart racing. Caleb rose slowly, motioning for silence. He climbed partway up the valley wall, peering out across the open ground beyond. When he returned, his expression was grim. The men were closer than expected, their persistence fueled by something more than orders. Caleb told Eliza they would not outrun them forever. He said there came a point when running turned into surrender by another name. He asked her what she wanted to do, not as a test but as a genuine question. The choice was hers now, and he would not take it from her. Eliza felt the weight of that freedom press down on her. She thought of the farm, of the town, of the alley and the gunshots. She thought of the way fear had shaped every step she had taken until now. Then she lifted her head and said she was tired of being chased, tired of having her life decided by men who believed they owned her. Caleb nodded once. He told her then that the valley could be turned from a trap into a stand, if they were careful and bold in equal measure. He explained his plan in low tones, pointing out ridges and blind spots, assigning her a role that required trust. She listened, absorbing every word, knowing there would be no second chance if they failed. They worked quickly, moving stones, positioning themselves where the land narrowed and forced approach. Eliza's hands shook as she took the rifle Caleb handed her, heavier than anything she had ever held. He showed her how to brace it, how to breathe, how to aim not with fear but with intention. He did not promise she would not have to fire. He promised only that he would not leave her. The sun dipped lower as the riders entered the valley, their confidence evident in their careless posture. They did not expect resistance. They did not expect the land itself to turn against them. When the first warning shot rang out, echoing sharp and sudden, confusion rippled through their ranks. Caleb's voice carried, firm and commanding, telling them to turn back while they still could. They answered with curses and gunfire. The valley erupted in sound, shots cracking against stone, dust rising in choking clouds. Eliza pressed herself against the rock, heart hammering, remembering Caleb's instructions. When one of the men moved into the open, closing too fast, she raised the rifle and fired, the recoil jarring her whole body. The shot struck the ground near his feet, enough to make him falter, to break his advance. She realized then that fear did not vanish when courage appeared. It simply learned to stand aside. The fight was brief but fierce, the narrow space robbing the pursuers of their advantage. When it ended, the men retreated, wounded pride and shaken resolve driving them back the way they had come. The valley fell silent again, the echoes fading slowly, leaving behind the sharp scent of smoke and the sound of Eliza's unsteady breath. She sank to the ground, the rifle slipping from her hands. Caleb knelt beside her, his face streaked with dust, his eyes searching hers. She expected praise or reproach, but he offered neither. He told her she had done what was needed. He told her she had stood. As the light softened into evening, they gathered their things and left the valley, knowing better than to linger. They traveled until night covered the land, then made camp beneath a stand of twisted trees. Eliza's body ached in ways she had never known, yet beneath the pain lay something fierce and alive. That night, she dreamed not of running, but of standing her ground, of facing the past without flinching. In the days that followed, their journey took on a new shape. Caleb trained her with intention now, teaching her to ride harder terrain, to track, to shoot with greater control. He treated her not as someone to be protected, but as someone to be prepared. Eliza rose to the challenge, her confidence growing with each lesson, her laughter returning in small, surprising moments. They spoke more openly as they traveled, sharing fragments of their lives, not everything, but enough to build understanding. Caleb spoke of mistakes made in anger, of people lost because he had believed strength meant never backing down. Eliza spoke of dreams she had never voiced, of a life where her choices mattered. As weeks passed, word reached them through scattered travelers that the men from the farm had not returned. Rumors spread, shifting and unreliable, but the pursuit faded, replaced by caution. The land itself seemed to breathe easier, as if acknowledging a balance restored. One evening, as they watched the sun set over distant hills, Caleb told Eliza there was a place farther west, a stretch of land few bothered with, harsh and demanding but free from the reach of her past. He said it was not easy ground, that it would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. He said he would take her there if she wished, but only if she understood that the road would not always be kind. Eliza looked at the horizon, at the wide-open future stretching before her. She thought of who she had been and who she was becoming. She told him she was ready to be tested. The fire crackled softly beside them, the night settling in with quiet certainty. The chase had changed them both, carving away what was weak and revealing what endured. Somewhere behind them lay fear and pursuit. Ahead lay uncertainty and choice. And for the first time, the road felt like it belonged to her. The land Caleb spoke of revealed itself slowly, as if testing their resolve before offering anything solid in return. Days of travel carried them farther west, where the sky seemed larger and the earth less forgiving, where grass thinned into stubborn patches and stone rose sharp from the ground like old scars refusing to heal. Eliza felt the change in her bones long before Caleb said a word, felt it in the way the wind cut colder at night and the way silence pressed heavier during the day. This was not land that welcomed the careless. They rode through it with measured patience, conserving strength and water, learning its moods. Caleb showed Eliza how to read the clouds for signs of sudden storms, how to find shelter where none seemed to exist, how to trust her instincts without surrendering to them. Each lesson carried weight, not just of survival but of belonging. The land did not offer comfort, but it offered honesty, and Eliza found she preferred that to the false safety she had known before. They reached a high ridge overlooking a broad basin carved by time and wind. Below lay a scattering of old homesteads, abandoned long ago, their frames silvered by sun and neglect. Caleb told her that people had tried to tame this place and failed, driven away by drought, isolation, or fear. He said that sometimes the land did not reject people because they were weak, but because they were unwilling to change. Eliza studied the basin, feeling something settle inside her. She said this place felt like a beginning rather than an ending. Caleb watched her closely, then nodded. He told her they would stay for a time, long enough to see whether the land would accept them. They chose one of the old homesteads near a shallow well that still held water. The structure leaned but stood, its walls worn yet stubborn, much like the people who once lived there. Repairing it became their first test. They worked side by side, hands blistered and backs aching, replacing broken boards, reinforcing beams, clearing debris that had gathered over years of abandonment. The labor was hard and honest, and Eliza found strength in it she had never known. Each repaired wall felt like a quiet declaration that she was no longer running, that she was building something with her own hands. Caleb watched her work with a mix of respect and concern, knowing that claiming land often drew attention from those who believed only the ruthless deserved it. That attention came sooner than expected. One afternoon, as Eliza hauled water from the well, she noticed a plume of dust rising in the distance. Riders appeared on the horizon, not the men from her past, but strangers all the same. Caleb saw them too, his body tensing as he set down his tools. He told Eliza to stay close, his voice calm but alert. The riders approached without haste, 3 men hardened by years of roaming, their eyes sharp as they took in the homestead. Their leader spoke first, asking questions that sounded polite but carried the weight of challenge. He asked how long they planned to stay, whose claim they believed they held. Caleb answered evenly, saying they were working the land and intended to remain. The man smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes. He said land like this attracted trouble, that protection could be arranged for the right price. The implication hung heavy in the air. Eliza felt anger rise, familiar and sharp. She stepped forward, meeting the man's gaze, telling him they did not need protection. Her voice did not waver. The man studied her, surprised, then laughed softly. He told them to reconsider that the West did not favor the unprepared. The riders left as they had come, leaving behind dust and unease. Caleb turned to Eliza, searching her face. She asked if she had spoken out of turn. He shook his head, saying the land had heard worse than truth spoken plainly. Yet he knew, as she did, that the visit was a warning, not a negotiation. That night, the wind howled across the basin, rattling the newly repaired walls. Eliza lay awake, listening, feeling the weight of what they had chosen. The fear returned in quiet waves, but it did not overwhelm her. She had faced worse with less. Days passed, marked by work and watchfulness. They repaired fencing, mapped the land, learned where water pooled after rare rains. Eliza grew more confident with the rifle, her aim steadying, her movements sure. Caleb saw in her not a follower but a partner, someone whose presence changed the rhythm of his life in ways he had not anticipated. Then came the storm. It arrived without warning, clouds rolling and fast and dark, the air heavy with the promise of violence. Wind tore across the basin, rain slashing sideways, turning earth into slick mud. They scrambled to secure what they could, fighting the elements with raw determination. Lightning split the sky, thunder shaking the ground beneath their feet. The storm tested the homestead and those who claimed it. Water threatened to breach the walls, forcing them to dig channels in the rain, hands numb and bleeding. Eliza slipped once, nearly swept away by a sudden rush of water, but Caleb caught her, hauling her back with a strength born of desperation. They worked through the night, refusing to yield. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving the land scarred but alive. The homestead stood, battered yet intact. Eliza sank onto the ground, exhausted, laughter bubbling up despite the ache in her body. She had faced the land and endured. It was then that they heard the horses. The same 3 riders returned, joined by others, their numbers larger, their intent clearer. They approached with confidence, believing the storm had weakened whoever remained. They did not expect to find two people standing their ground. Caleb positioned himself between the riders and the homestead, Eliza at his side. The leader spoke again, his tone less friendly now. He said the land was theirs, that those who tried to settle without paying tribute did not last long. He gestured to his men, a silent threat. Eliza felt fear flicker, but it did not root her in place. She spoke before Caleb could, her voice carrying across the open ground. She told them the land did not belong to bullies, that it belonged to those willing to work it and defend it. She said they had already faced the worst this place could throw at them and were still standing. The men laughed, but there was uncertainty there now. Caleb stepped forward, his presence steady, his words few. He said they would not leave, and they would not be moved easily. He said bloodshed would gain nothing. The standoff stretched, tension thick enough to taste. At last, the leader spat into the dirt, his pride wounded but his caution intact. He told them this was not over. The riders turned away, their retreat slow and deliberate. As they disappeared into the distance, Eliza felt a release she had not expected. She had faced men like these before, but never as an equal, never with a choice. The land had demanded a price, and she had paid it with courage rather than submission. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the basin, Caleb and Eliza sat together outside the homestead. The air was cool, the silence no longer threatening but companionable. Caleb spoke of staying, of building something real, of seeing whether this harsh place could become home. Eliza looked out across the land, feeling its weight and its promise. She knew challenges remained, that danger had not vanished, but she also knew she was no longer the girl who ran barefoot at dawn. She had faced fear, stood against those who sought to own her, and claimed a future shaped by her own hands. The land lay quiet beneath the stars, waiting to see if they would endure. The morning broke clear and sharp, the sky washed clean by the storm that had tested both land and spirit, and Eliza rose with a quiet determination that surprised even her. She stepped outside the homestead, breathing in the cold air, feeling the firmness of the ground beneath her boots. The basin stretched wide and silent, the scars of rain already settling into the earth as if the land itself were healing. This place no longer felt like a challenge waiting to break her, but like a trial she had survived and earned the right to face again. Caleb watched her from the doorway, seeing the change that had taken root over weeks of hardship and choice. He remembered the girl who had run barefoot across open fields, driven by fear alone, and he saw now a woman who stood still and measured the world before moving. The West had a way of shaping people, stripping away what was false and leaving only what could endure, and Eliza had endured more than most. They spent the early hours repairing what the storm had damaged, moving with an ease born of shared effort. Words were few, but understanding passed freely between them. Each task completed felt like another stone set in the foundation of something lasting. The land watched, indifferent yet attentive as it always did. By midday, a rider appeared at the edge of the basin, alone this time, moving slowly and without threat. Caleb's hand drifted toward his rifle out of habit, but Eliza stepped forward, her gaze steady. The rider dismounted at a respectful distance, revealing an older man with weathered features and eyes that had seen many seasons. He introduced himself as someone who had once tried to work this land and failed, driven away by forces less visible than drought or storm. He spoke of the men who claimed power through fear, of how they eventually fell because the land did not favor cruelty for long. He said word had spread of two people standing their ground here, and he had come not to challenge but to warn. The men who had ridden away after the storm would return, he said, and next time they would bring more than threats. Eliza listened closely, absorbing every word. She thanked the man for his honesty and asked him what had driven him away all those years ago. He answered without bitterness, saying he had not been ready to pay the price the land demanded. He looked at her then, really looked, and nodded once, as if seeing something familiar. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving behind both warning and affirmation. Caleb turned to Eliza, his expression thoughtful. He said they could still leave, that nothing bound them here except choice. He said there were other places, easier places, where danger did not linger so close. Eliza considered his words, then shook her head. She said running would only teach the land that fear still owned her, She said if trouble was coming, she would face it where she stood. The days that followed were marked by preparation. They reinforced the homestead, planned escape routes they hoped never to use, and practiced until movement and response became instinct. Eliza trained harder than ever, her muscles strengthening, her aim sharpening, her confidence no longer fragile. Caleb watched her with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing the West rewarded courage but demanded blood for mistakes. When the riders returned, they did not come quietly. Dust rose in heavy clouds, hooves thundered across the basin, and the sound carried the promise of violence. Eliza felt the familiar surge of fear, but it did not paralyze her. She moved with purpose, taking her position, remembering every lesson learned. Caleb stood beside her, his presence steady, his resolve unshaken. The men spread out, surrounding the homestead, their leader stepping forward with a smile that held no warmth. He spoke of inevitability, of how the West always chose the strong. Eliza answered him, her voice carrying across the open ground, telling him strength did not come from taking what others built, but from standing when it would be easier to kneel. The leader laughed, then gave the signal. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal, the air filled with sound and motion, dust and determination. Eliza fired when she had to, her movements precise, her mind clear. She did not fight with rage but with resolve, protecting what she had chosen to claim. Caleb moved like a force shaped by years of hard lessons, defending without cruelty, ending threats without excess. The land bore witness as it always had, indifferent to who bled and who stood, caring only that balance was restored. When the last rider fled, wounded pride and broken while carrying him away, silence returned to the basin. The homestead still stood, scarred but unbroken. Eliza lowered her rifle, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. Caleb came to her side, his face marked with dust and sweat, his eyes searching hers. She laughed then, a sound raw and full, the release of everything she had carried since the day she ran. Tears followed, but they were not born of fear. They buried the remnants of violence with care, honoring the land rather than glorifying the fight. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the basin, Eliza felt a deep sense of rightness settle within her. The West had tested her and found her willing to stand. In the weeks that followed, word spread that the basin was no longer easy ground, that those who sought to rule through fear had failed. Travelers passed by, nodding in quiet respect, leaving them to their work. The land grew familiar, its harshness softened by understanding rather than submission. Eliza learned to love the rhythm of the days, the honest exhaustion of labor, the quiet companionship of evenings spent watching the stars. Caleb found a peace he had not known he was seeking, a sense of purpose rooted not in wandering but in building. One evening, as they sat outside the homestead, the fire casting gentle light across the ground, Caleb spoke of the future. He spoke not of grand promises but of shared work, of seasons yet to come, of facing whatever the land demanded together. Eliza listened, her heart full, knowing that the West had not given her this life freely, but she had earned every part of it. She looked out across the basin, remembering the girl who had fled her family's land with nothing but fear, and she smiled at the woman she had become. The West had changed her course, not through mercy but through challenge, and she would never trade that truth for safety again. The land lay quiet beneath the stars, and for the first time it felt like it belonged to her.